Welcome to One-on-One with Expert Flyer. This is your host, Lisa Kaslan, and today we're getting an update on the environment and the United States plans and progress to date as it relates to reducing airline CO2 emissions. Our guest is Nancy Young. She's the Vice President of Environmental Affairs for a wonderful organization called Airlines for America. How you doing, Nancy?
I'm great, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So before we get into the meat and potatoes, tell us a little bit about Airlines for America and what you do.
Well, we represent the major U.S. airlines, passenger and cargo airlines, and on the issues that they largely have in common. That would be security and safety and environment. Environmental protection is very high on the list of our member airlines, and we help them advance their interests in sustainability.
Great. Okay. So you're the perfect person for us to talk to today because we have really been trying to get our head around the ICAO CoreSIA plan and sort of what is really going on, rubber meets the road stuff in terms of reducing emissions. And I think the goal of the plan is to reduce emissions by about 50% over the next 30 years. Is that right?
Well, that is not exactly the CoreSIA plan, but CoreSIA is a very big part of a plan. So
okay.
The U.S. airlines are part of a global aviation coalition that has set aggressive carbon goals. And in fact, we've had those in place since 2009. And the first was to improve our fuel efficiency on an annual average basis by 1.5%, and then achieve carbon neutral growth from 2020, and then a net 50% reduction in carbon dioxide in 2050 relative to 2005 levels. And ICAO's carbon offsetting reduction scheme for international aviation, CoreSIA, is intended to help us meet that carbon neutral growth from 2020 goal. What we do is we've been driving technology and operations and infrastructure for fuel efficiency improvements. And in fact, we have a tremendous fuel efficiency record, 130% fuel efficiency improvement in the United States since 1978, saving over 5 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide. So building on that and adding sustainable aviation fuels to achieve carbon neutral growth, we found that there could still be a gap in achieving carbon neutral growth from 2020 because people want to fly and they want to ship goods, and we want to do that responsibly. So CoreSIA kicks in as a carbon offsetting system in 2021 for international aviation to fill that gap if we don't achieve carbon neutral growth through the other measures: technology, operations, infrastructure, sustainable fuels. Now, industry itself has this 2050 goal, and the countries at the International Civil Aviation Organization haven't yet set a 2050 goal. And that is part of the work that we're doing with the countries to have international agreement on a future long-term goal. But we're all really focused on implementing the carbon neutral growth from 2020 goal.
Okay, so just so we have a clear understanding, is this first, chapter of CoreSIA, this MRV plan, what is it, measurement, reporting, and verification, where airlines are asked to submit data associated with their current emissions?
Yes, so that's perfect, actually. The Emissions Monitoring, Reporting, and Verification Scheme is part one of CoreSIA, and that went into effect on January 1 of 2019. And that requires all of the aircraft operators in the world with international operations to report to their government their fuel burn, and hence that relates directly to their carbon emissions.
Okay.
And we've been doing that in the United States since the 1950s, essentially under DOT, Department of Transportation regulations. But the CoreSIA requires that data to be cut in a different way. And so the MRV requirements that went in place for us in 2019 were just a cut of data that we were already providing to our government.
Okay. So as I understand it, this first stage is voluntary on the part of the airlines. Now, is that because you already have the data that you need? You just need to sort of re-swizzle it, reanalyze it?
Well, there are really two reasons. The International Civil Aviation Organization finalized its rules for this emissions monitoring, reporting, and verification in October of 2018. So there was no time under the U.S. regulatory system to revise the U.S. regulations that we already report under to tell us, okay, now cut that data another way in addition to what you report. So we worked with the government to agree. We're reporting the data anyway, so we will agree voluntarily to cut it that way until you adopt a regulation that specifies cutting that way.
Okay, so we have data. You just have to do a little bit more work.
Yes, it's putting it in a different form for purposes of this program.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you for that clarification. So tell me, you were at the recent, I think it was the 40th annual ICAO Assembly. I think it was in Canada last month.
Yeah, that's correct. Every 3 years, the 193 countries come together to make key decisions on standards and practices and policy for international aviation, and that just concluded.
Okay. So did any news come out of that we should know about?
Well, I think from our perspective on the environmental front, there are a couple of key takeaways. One, in 2016, ICAO agreed to two major aviation climate initiatives. One we've talked about, CoreSIA, and the other one, a carbon dioxide standard for future aircraft that would apply to the manufacturers. And I think the news coming out of this assembly is that the majority of countries overwhelmingly re-endorsed those agreements, and in addition, agreed that that they will work on a work plan as governments toward adopting a future long-term goal akin to what industry has as our 50% net reduction goal in 2050. So it's good to see the governments working together themselves towards what would be a long-term goal when the industry thinks that that's an important aspect for our own work.
That's great. That's great. So talk about, for a little bit, some of the technological advances, and when we talk about alternative fuels that carriers might implement, what is that? I mean, when I think of fuel, I don't think of electricity. I think power, but I could be wrong. Can you describe that a little bit for us?
Yeah, we're really excited both about the technology piece, which is the aircraft itself, and what we can do to make it more fuel efficient. So aerodynamics, putting, the things that you see at the tip of your wing, the winglets, help make that aircraft more aerodynamic, flying farther on less fuel. So there are lots of things we're doing with the aircraft engine and basically the airframe, and we're working towards hybrid electric and electric propulsion on key programs with FAA and NASA. But we're also really excited about transitioning our liquid fuels to sustainable aviation fuels. And that alternative jet fuel can come from a number of sources, municipal solid waste. For example, a couple of our members have agreements for future supply from literally from garbage. But right now, United Airlines is taking supply of alternative fuels from waste oils in Los Angeles airport. So you can take these biomaterials and process them to be equivalent to jet fuel, and they can bring up to an 80% reduction in carbon dioxide.
Oh, that's definitely good news. Now, I know that you can't really talk about how this will affect consumer pricing, but it doesn't seem like it's all bad news, right?
Well, no, that's a really good way of putting it. So airlines are very, very motivated to be fuel efficient. And a lot of what we're talking about here is fuel efficiency, which relates directly to carbon efficiency. So, the more that we make our planes aerodynamic, the better that we do in flying them in the air traffic space that FAA affords to us, the more we can reduce weight on them or improve the technology of the engine, that reduces our fuel burn and hence our costs. So that can be a win-win. And there are additional regulatory programs like the Carbon Offsetting Reduction Scheme for International Aviation that add a sort of regulatory cost. But as a highly regulated industry, we're very familiar with kind of how to manage those within providing the goods and services that we do, or moving people and goods the way we do.
Excellent. Okay, is there anything that I haven't asked that I should have, that we should know about?
One of the things we haven't talked about is really the context. We've been interested to find out that people are surprised that the U.S. airlines are only 2% of the nation's greenhouse gas emissions, while driving more than 5% of its GDP.
Yeah.
And that story, I think, is really important because a lot of people are concerned about the potential for growth in our emissions, and that's why we have, 2% is not nothing, but it's pretty low, but we're committed to these emissions fuel efficiency targets, carbon neutral growth from 2020, and our 2050 goals to make sure that people can continue to be proud that they're flying in an environmentally friendly environment.
Absolutely. And, you're waving a banner for other industries to follow your lead.
Well, we are the first industry that has had a global market-based measure applying to it, and that we are in the process of implementing. So we're very proud of our work on that and commitment to that.
Well, we thank you for all your contributions. It was wonderful talking to you and education, and we hope to have you back.
Well, delighted to talk to you, and any time.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.